The boundary between Scripture and Apocrypha, the line that defines what counts as the Bible, was drawn first by someone using it to cut out the Old Testament entirely. In 144, Marcion of Sinope walked into Rome with Christianity's first closed canon, built on the claim that the God of Moses and the Father of Jesus were different beings and could not coexist in the same book. The Church expelled him as a heretic, then refined his technique for 200 years. A closed set. A list. 10 letters of Paul. One Gospel, Luke's, but shorter. He said, "This is it. This is what belongs. Everything else is contamination." The Church expelled him by nightfall. But they kept the idea. Before Marcion, there was no Christian scripture in the way we use that word now. There were Gospels, plural. There were letters circulating between communities. There was the Septuagint, the Greek version of Jewish texts that Christians read as prophecy. But no one had drawn a line around any of it and said, "Here, not there." Marcion was the first to do that. And he did it not by preserving tradition, but by cutting it away. His reasoning was surgical. He believed the God of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Creator, the Lawgiver, the God of wrath and nation and sacrifice, was not the same as the God that Jesus revealed. Jesus spoke of a Father no one had known. A God of mercy without condition. A God who did not demand blood. Marcion read the same texts everyone else did. He arrived somewhere else. And so he removed the entire Hebrew Bible from his collection. He edited Luke's Gospel to remove references to Jewish prophecy. He kept Paul, but only the letters he believed were uncontaminated by Jewish influence. He created the first Christian canon by subtraction. Tertullian, writing 50 years later in his Adversus Marcionem, called him a butcher. He said Marcion took a knife to Scripture the way he once took a knife to ship timber. He accused him of mutilating the text, of inventing a new God, of seducing the faithful with a gospel stripped of its roots. Tertullian wrote 5 books against Marcion. 5 books against one man. That tells you something about how far Marcion's collection had spread. Because it did spread. By the end of the 2nd century, Marcionite churches existed across the Roman world, from Antioch to Carthage, from Egypt to Gaul. They used Marcion's canon. They rejected the God of the Old Testament. And in doing so, they created a problem that could not be ignored. If Marcion was the first to say this is Scripture, then what were the Orthodox to say? If he drew the line, where would they draw it? The response was not immediate. It was not coordinated. But it was decisive. Irenaeus in Gaul. Tertullian in Carthage. Origen in Alexandria. They began to argue for a different collection. For Gospels, not one. The writings of multiple apostles, not just Paul. And most importantly, the retention of the Hebrew Scriptures as the foundation, not the contamination. They argued that the God who spoke to Moses was the same God who sent Jesus. That the law and the prophets testified to Christ. That you could not understand the gospel without understanding what came before it. John Barton, in his essay Marcion Revisited, points out something uncomfortable. He writes that without Marcion, the Church might never have felt the need to define a canon at all. That the pressure to say this, that came not from internal conviction, but from external threat. That orthodoxy, in this sense, was formed in reaction. The 4 Gospels. The inclusion of Acts to connect the story of Jesus to the story of the early Church. The gradual acceptance of letters beyond Paul, Peter, James, John, Jude. All of it articulated in response to a man they called a heretic. Which raises a question about origins. When we open a New Testament today, we are opening a collection that took its shape, at least in part, because Marcion forced the issue. The Church did not decide what was Scripture in a vacuum. It decided in argument. It decided in defense. And the opponent, the one who forced the first decision, is the same man whose name became synonymous with deviation. Tertullian preserved Marcion's positions in order to refute them. Ironically, this means we know more about Marcion's theology than we do about most early Christian movements, because the Orthodox wrote against him so thoroughly. We have reconstructions of his Apostolikon, his canon, based on the quotations Tertullian provides while tearing them apart. We have his arguments, secondhand. His Gospel of Luke, edited and abbreviated, visible only in the spaces where Tertullian says here, Marcion removed this verse. We know Marcion by what was written to destroy him. And yet the structure he introduced, the idea that some texts are in, and some texts are out, that structure survived. It became the grammar of Christian authority. It became the mechanism by which tradition policed itself. Marcion lost the argument. But he won the method. So when we ask where the Bible came from, the answer is more tangled than we admit. It came from councils and copyists and bishops and debates that stretched across centuries. But it also came from a shipowner in the 2nd century who looked at the texts in circulation and said, not all of this is true. Some of this has to go. He cut the wrong things, they said. He kept the wrong gospel. He followed the wrong Paul. But he was the first to say that cutting was necessary. And once that idea entered the room, it never left. Tertullian called him a heretic. Irenaeus called him a deceiver. But they used his blueprint. They defined orthodoxy by defining its edges. They established the New Testament by saying what Marcion had gotten wrong. And in doing so, they confirmed the one thing Marcion had insisted from the beginning, that not everything handed down was scripture. That some voice, some authority, had to decide. The question is, would the church have drawn that line without him pressing the blade into their hands?